Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on risks to water resources. This has been prepared by the International Actuarial Association's Resource and Environment Working Group, and we greatly appreciate your joining us today for what I think is a very important topic in terms of both the future environment and also the work of the REWG. Just to give you a little background on our working group, our purpose is to serve as a working group within the IAA, and we're devoted to resource and environment issues that have relevance to and/or affect the work of actuaries in their various areas of practice and are relevant to the subject of actuarial science or to which the actuarial profession may be able to contribute. We've put out a number of papers recently, and I've been privileged to have had a role in all of these. And the first one mentioned there is climate change insurance and vulnerable populations. We did a webinar on that earlier this year. That dealt with how climate change is affecting the most vulnerable amongst us. And in particular, we discussed how climate change was affecting some of the vulnerable populations in developing countries, and some of the interesting tools that are being used to assist them with improving their financial security. We did another paper on flood risks, which talked about the background on the issue of flood and how various insurance systems and governmental systems can be used to control this very significant risk. We did a paper on decarbonization, and also another one in 2017 on climate change and mortality. We're currently working on a disclosure document for pension plans and a chapter for the IAA risk book on climate change, which is, part of a really excellent book the IAA is putting out on various aspects of risk. And I'd commend that to you to help you learn about various risk aspects and various perspectives on that from authors around the world. So this webcast is based on an REWG paper, which is entitled Risks to Water Resources. The main purpose of the paper is really to start a conversation on water resource risk among actuaries and then within the broader scientific and public policy communities. Actuaries need to be informed about broader societal issues such as this one. And water resource reflects a wide range of perils that are commonly insured. And once actuaries are informed in this important area, we'll be better positioned to make a positive contribution to policy development. The paper can be accessed on the IAA website, actuaries.org, and you can select publications and papers to view it. The paper itself is available there in PDF form, and we will make a copy of this webcast slide and the slides available for download at a later point. Today's presenters include myself. I'm Ray Muslin from Australia. We also have Dale Hall, who is a speaker from the US. And we had been scheduled to have Micheline Dion from Canada, who is the leader of the REWG and the Climate Risk Task Force, join us, and Stephen Lowe, who was also a contributor to the paper. I will be presenting on behalf of Micheline and Steve today, and Dale is with us to present on his sections of the paper. But I should acknowledge the very strong contribution that Steve and Micheline made to this effort, and to also note that Steve was the leader of the group that put this paper together.
Right.
So
this is Christian. If I can just jump in, Micheline did connect, so she's there, and Steve is there now as well.
Oh, okay. Well, that's excellent. So on that basis, then I will turn it over to Steve when we get there. And I apologize, I was unaware that they were there. And Micheline, hopefully I did not do too much damage to the introduction that you were so kindly going to make. Is there anything you'd like to say, Micheline, before we continue?
No, thank you very much. And sorry, everybody, for having some connection problems.
Okay, well, we'll bring Micheline back in later to do Q&A. So I'm going to cover the next section, and then I'll be turning it over to Steve. So to first off, kind of why did we talk about water resource risk and what's the purpose of our paper? So if you think about resource and environmental risks, there's many things which affect our environment. And again, some of this is sort of beyond simply thinking about the most important threat of our time, which is climate change. But we certainly have many issues with plastic pollution. There are, massive amounts of plastic that are not only affecting wildlife and fisheries, but also collecting in large swaths of the ocean. And this is a massive issue. We also have other topics like wheat rust, which is a disease that affects wheat production and can affect the food supplies. We have antibiotic resistant bugs, which can affect people's health and also challenge science to be able to control the infections that afflict many of us, particularly those of us who end up in hospitals. Deforestation is another huge issue in many parts of the world, and deforestation not only causes issues with releasing carbon into the atmosphere when the wood is burned or otherwise used, but it also helps trigger erosion and flooding issues, and significantly affects the livelihood of the people who live in those areas. And since I happen to live in Australia, and we certainly had an experience last year with bushfires. That's the view out from basically where my office is in Sydney. And we had situations where it was very difficult to even see the Harbour Bridge for the amount of smoke that was released by the terrible bushfires that we had last year. So there are a large number of resource and environmental risks which affect our environment. But why water resources, and why did we pick that one for this paper and webinar? Well, obviously, water is critical to survival, and many water systems, both natural and man-made, are under significant stress. Water shortages can lead to significant disruptions in economies, societies, and political systems. And the World Health Organization has published a hierarchy of water needs and estimated the amounts that are be required in an emergency. And the graph on the right shows you graphically the significant amount of water that is required to provide human sustenance. Not only the obvious things like drinking and cooking, but also washing, growing food, sanitation and waste disposal, which I'll come back to later in my part of the presentation, crops, livestock, etc. So water is a huge issue, not only significant to human survival, but a massive component of the quality of life that many of us take for granted too often. So the purpose of this paper, first off, is to help us understand the risks to water supplies and the water systems that feed our society, And basically to help us understand these risks, they can be more effectively prioritized and managed. And certainly there are prevention efforts that help us before we have water crises, and then there's mitigation efforts which we use post-event, floods, droughts, etc. The main goal of this paper and webinar is to start a conversation among actuaries first, but then among the broader scientific and policy communities. This is an opportunity to apply risk management capabilities of actuaries to a new problem. We often think about risk management in terms of, say, hedging currency risk or asset liability matching when we're talking about valuations and reserves. But exactly the same principles can be applied to risk management challenges across a wide range of things that we face as actuaries and as humans, in the planet. And water risk management is certainly one of those things. And this, I guess, to conclude, serves as a reminder that there's more to resource and environment issues than global warming and climate change. And while obviously global warming and climate change are a huge issue that it should be the key focus of our attention, there are other things, as I listed before: plastics pollution, health effects from smoke, deforestation, etc., that also merit our attention. And, water risk is an excellent example of both a different type of risk, but also how this risk interacts with climate and other risks. So with that, we'll turn it over to Steve to cover the structure of the risk identification and risk assessment that we used in this paper.
Thank you, Ray. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes.
Good. Thanks. I've been interested in water resource risks since 9/11, actually. I have a very good friend who was at the time the risk manager for the New York City transit system, including responsibility for Grand Central Terminal. And in talking with him about those events and just more generally about risk management, he mentioned to me that at that time, there was only one aqueduct that brought water from upstate New York, where the reservoirs are, down to Manhattan. And he said if the terrorists had driven the planes into the aqueduct and destroyed the aqueduct, then the entire city would have been without water until that could be repaired, which would have taken even in using Operation Warp Speed, it would still have taken a month to repair. So that was a very significant issue. And fortunately, since 9/11, they've completed the second major aqueduct, which runs water down. So they have redundancy in the system now. In addition, water and water shortages were identified as the #1 risk in a survey of extreme risks that I participated in developing a few years ago. So this is important. Let's go on to the next slide. So one of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to apply what we considered contemporary risk management techniques to the issue of water resource risk. And our starting point was risk identification, where we generated a generalized risk register. We saw this as an opportunity to showcase some actuarial risk management techniques. A risk register is designed to organize potential threats. Think of them as a sort of a comprehensive way in an organized manner to develop a list of risks. I've used risk registers in several board situations to facilitate a thoughtful discussion of risks. I have several boards who regularly revisit the register periodically to reassess risk. There's nothing magical or complicated about the risk register. It simply approaches the problem in an organized way. What could happen? And for the water resource risk register, we broke the problem first into 3 broad areas. Shown here, the water goes elsewhere. The supply becomes insufficient to the needs in an immediate way and significant way. Alternatively, the water could be there, but the delivery system could be significantly disrupted. For example, as I mentioned, if an aqueduct were destroyed. And then third, the water is there and the delivery system is working, but the water is not drinkable, either because of high levels of industrial pollution or a flood which caused the fresh water and the sewage to mix together. This generalized risk register is sort of broad-based. When we get to specific water systems, you would customize it to suit the situation. Wade, let's go on to the next slide. I won't go through the risk register in detail on this presentation. Certainly encourage you to look at it when you read the paper. But this is a fuller picture of the risk register. It's still at a generalized level, not drilled down to a specific water system. One advantages of this risk register approach that we see is that it could be applied. If we use the same risk register across all water systems, then facilitation of comparison across them is enhanced. In the risk register, when you look at specific areas, you'll see that climate change is an important element in some areas, but it represents only one dimension of water risk. And when you drill down, the specific system comes into play. For example, some systems derive their water from rivers, and these rivers could be diverted by other countries who currently share the river resource. This is true in several parts of the world. It's true in the U.S. in respects to the Colorado River, which is a shared resource between all the states that are south and west of the Rockies, where the snow melt turns into the river and feeds California, Arizona, and Mexico, et cetera. So, Ray, let's go on to the next slide. In addition to once we really had the risks, then we went through a sort of a risk assessment, which starts with developing a classification of risks. And we did this along 4 dimensions, the 4 dimensions that are listed here. The first is likelihood, which we classified risks as either being imminent, probable, unlikely, very likely, or speculative. We did not assign probabilities, and we don't believe that probabilities are necessary in early stages of such an analysis. It's sufficient to create the categories, but for those of you who, as actuaries, are wanting more numbers than are in the current paper, you could think of imminent as 1 in 5. You could think of probable as 1 in 10. You could think of unlikely as 1 in 50. You could think of very unlikely as 1 in 100, and you could think of speculative as 1 in 1,000. We wanted to look at the scope of the impact. Is the impact local? Is it regional? Is it global? And as you'll see, while we're focused on specific water resource systems in various locales, those locales would be affected, and that would certainly be a major local impact, but there are regional and even global impacts that flow. The global impacts in particular are second-order effects that need to be considered. We also classified the events based on the extent of impact. There, the categories are disruptive, endurable, crushing, and existential. You can think of these as if you consider yourself. An endurable risk could represent a broken leg. A crushing risk might be a loss of limb or a paralysis. And an existential risk could be the loss of life, of course. The scope of the impact attempts to convey both spatial and temporal information by use of these four categories. We'll cover that. And lastly, controllability. Is the event preventable, or is it unpreventable? Is it mitigatable or unmitigatable? Thinking about controllability from both a pre-event and a post-event situation. One risk along all four dimensions that I think is illustrative is to consider an alien invasion. Those of you who have seen one of the War of the World movies, either the original or the more recent version, can understand what I'm talking about. An alien in that movie, aliens invade, and they're seeking to turn the world, the Earth, into a resource for them. So they intend to exterminate the human population and take over all the natural resources. Such a risk is, of course, speculative. We don't really know what the probability would be even. It's global in scope, it's existential, and it's largely unpreventable and largely unmitigatable, as those movies demonstrate. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the New York water system. In the paper, each of the papers, each of the three authors agreed to look at one water resource system, to develop a specific risk register, and then to engage in a preliminary risk assessment for that system. So I took the New York City system, which is illustrated in this graphic. The system provides 1.2 billion gallons of water every day to New York City. Its reservoirs are filled by watershed that includes over 1 million acres of land. There are 3 major aqueducts which carry water by gravity to the city. And the water is distributed throughout the city by 6,800 miles of water mains. For those of you who ever saw the movie Die Hard with a Vengeance, they actually show the new aqueduct that I mentioned earlier when it was under construction. It's a tube large enough to drive a dump truck up and down. As I say, it was completed just a few years ago. Okay, let's go on. So we looked into the New York City system and learned there's a lot of readily available public information on these systems. In terms of, New York City is very actively involved in prevention and mitigation activities. The development in the watershed is restricted. It's mostly the Catskill Mountains and areas that was fortunately not developed in the early development of New York. There's a lot of protected land and a lot of land that's actually owned by the city. The water system has its own dedicated police force. 200 policemen are specifically focused on protecting the system. Tunnel 3 adds a level of redundancy, allowing the city to shut off the older aqueducts at various points and engage in repairs. And it assures that unless all 3 of those aqueducts were damaged at the same time, water would be available. It's important in understanding the specifics of the system that 95% of the water is delivered by gravity. So there's no need for electricity in order for the water system to operate for New York. That is not true in some other cities. The city is also very concerned about pollution to the water, either through man-made activity, but including both terrorism and other types of events, but also just industrial activity. They have throughout the city, throughout the system, they have 965 water sampling stations, and they sample from 50 of those stations randomly every single day. They've also, several years ago, they earmarked $240 million to specifically address leakage over 5 years. These systems all have leakage issues. The leakage issues vary. Leakage is not terribly significant in the New York City system, but when you have 6,000 miles of pipes and aqueducts systems, you do have leakage, and so they're focused very much on conservation of the water through addressing the leakage issue. Wait, let's go on. So this is the risk assessment summary for New York, and this chart I also won't go through in detail, but the high-level conclusions would be that the system is relatively secure. There are no imminent risks. There are, the system is well managed. It's the prevention and mitigation are organized and well financed. New York is a wealthy city in an important area, and it serves as a major financial center. So naturally, there's governmental support at all levels for the system. The main risk that the system faces is an attack on the infrastructure. Either the dams or the aqueducts could be attacked, or the water itself could be polluted. They're unlikely. The effects would be regional, but except for the financial system issue, which is that if New York became uninhabitable because there was no water there, then the financial system would be potentially disrupted while alternative locations were brought online. There are alternative systems for the New York Financial Center, but some of those unfortunately are located in New Jersey, and if the New York City water supply were disrupted, the New Jersey water system would be overloaded, I think, as people left the 5 boroughs of New York and moved into other areas where water was still available. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dale Hall, who will take us through the Mexico City system.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And I do want to re-echo Raid's comments at the beginning. Big thanks to Steve for coordinating across all of us the project. I think it ended up in a really helpful and interesting report for the IAA. I'm going to focus, as Steve was noting, on the Mexico City water system. So, Raid, if we can go to the next slide. Just a little bit of background. Mexico City was really founded on the concept of water, kind of the vision of water. The early Aztec civilization had this vision of a eagle capturing a snake while perched atop a cactus in the middle of a grand lake, and they found it and decided to create a major city where that occurred. And that today is Mexico City. That kind of vision is replicated, if you're familiar with the Mexican flag, with the eagle and the snake on top of a cactus. And from the early days, it grew into this very large, important city in Central America. It's clearly the largest city in North America, over 20 million residents, and since it's a tourism and government center, I think up to 40 million external visitors come to Mexico City every year. Mexico is a vibrant population, very kind of relatively compared to other country's a young country, high fertility rates and growing life expectancies. So, becoming a strong economic power around the world. One of the things that probably started to create its water issue, at least in the city itself, was to expand and to continue development when the Spanish began to develop further the city. They drained all the lakes around the city. They needed the land to be able to do other things, to build houses, to raise food, and that became part of the ongoing issue of what's being seen in Mexico City with water issues today. Maybe a quick trivia question would be, if you can name different cities that really don't have a river running through them, or they're on the coast, and Mexico City is probably part of that trivia answer. Johannesburg in South Africa. Maybe we'd look today to Orlando, although with a lot of lakes, or Phoenix in the US, or Atlanta as a railway junction, but very rare for cities, especially of this size, to have no natural rivers flowing in or out of it. And so Mexico City is unique in that it's surrounded essentially by mountain ranges. We were there for the IAA meeting about 2 years ago, and literally, if you look in all directions, you see those mountain ranges. So it's in the bottom of this closed valley, and that leads to the city more relying on new rainfall for water instead of a natural river source or snowmelt coming through. Probably one of the big issues that Mexico City faces today is also land subsidence. With the city built on this dry lake that gets replenished every year, there is an enormous amount of land subsidence in Mexico City. Many areas of the city are sinking, not always at the same rate. It gets pretty evident if you visit monuments or businesses or different places around the city where they're routinely adding a new step to the monument every year or two, just to make up for the declining or the subsiding of the land around it. The civilization and had some solutions that at first seemed to work fairly well. They built a grand canal, really one of the marvels of the earliest 20th century, where it came to engineering, and it was completed. It helped bring through the city a more consistent water. Unfortunately, because of all the movement of land, gravity started to not be able to fulfill its needs anymore, where what was once high ground, what was once low ground was certainly changing, and it really increased the need to transition to pumping stations to make sure that water continued to flow. As the saying goes in Mexico City, when it rains, it pours. The rainfall is limited to kind of a rainy season. Oftentimes, the challenge becomes when it does rain, can the city capture all that is there without losing it to making it flow out of the natural system, or at least it will resupply the aquifer that is beneath the city. But as we've seen, the demand continues to exceed that supply, and I think that's their current concern, and the ongoing challenge is how do we have a growing population that increases with its water needs, but a supply that is very reliant upon rain coming and being captured. The land movement also really leads to some structures with infrastructure, some issues with infrastructure where pipe breakage and the need to maintain the whole system is part of the economic problem that they face. Sometimes a lot of water is lost due to leakage of the system, and that kind of creates in turn a more of an economic and socioeconomic issue. There's high demand, there's low supply. In some parts of the city, especially in the poorer parts of the city, families are spending in excess of 20% of their income to have water privately delivered in a way that's bottled, the way they have confidence in using it, so they don't run into reuse of water issues. Probably also has started to create a little bit of a health issue because bottled soda and juices are also they become sometimes more available or cheaper solution, but that also does cause downstream health issues. Diabetes and other diseases are often growing in the Mexican population. So if we go to the next slide, I think just some information on the different ways that risk prevention and mitigation are happening in this particular system. Public officials are certainly trying to bring water from far away, from distant sources through pipelines into the city. And that's been a growing program for the Mexico City officials. A large program that started around 2007, 2008, 2009 to do more water sustainability, to have a green plan in place, trying to get more of an equilibrium in the aquifer that feeds the city. Pumping infrastructure certainly being added as other further subsidence and land movement is occurring. And I think a collective focus now with CONAGUA, the National Water Authority, on ways to do more prevention and sustainability into their system. How do we have, when the floods do occur, how do we bring them effectively into the system without inundating it? What are ways that we can treat wastewater so that people aren't reusing water that would not be good for their health, and reduce overutilization of groundwater? There's fortunately, a lot of opportunity for lakes. If you in the city, they have a beautiful lake and canal system at Xochimilco, and trying to capture that more effectively, and kind of that combined with the focus on reducing residential water use, reducing the loss of through waste in their network, and increasing the reuse and treatment of wastewater. Next slide also gives a little bit of the significant risks. I mean, one of the issues that Steve noted, unlike New York City, is gravity is not necessarily part fully of the system. So you can create a solution, but you can create another problem at the same time. You can trade a water issue, but then it becomes an energy issue. There's an increased reliance on electricity the more you do pumping. The land movement is certainly likely to continue. It increases the need for future pumping. There's certainly a risk that climate differences may occur, that the monsoons or the large amount of rain that has been happening may not always continue. So that's a significant risk. Is there a risk potentially of just the aquifer being fully depleted? There is, and then you'd run into a population issue of the region becoming uninhabitable. And then there's a cost effectiveness. If the repairs that are needed get to be too expensive, should there be other investments that are made to find different sources? And then finally, the last on Mexico City is just the risk assessment summary. Probably again, the things to note are the movement of land, or if there were, earthquakes or other things that causes the supply and the pumping to fail. I think that can be a catastrophe if water wasn't able to flow frequently, especially to many parts of a growing and large city. With that, let me flip it to Raid for an overview of India.
Thank you very much, Dale. India is a fascinating country in many respects, and one which is a myriad of many cultures, and it has a long and rich history, and it's dependent heavily on water, and there are some significant issues with the Indian water system, and it's a rapidly developing country which is under significant water stress. It is on track to become the most populous country in the world. And while the country receives a lot of rain and snowfall, the water supplies are stressed because the precipitation is very seasonal. There's if any of you have ever spent time in India, you'll know that there is a significant dry season followed by a monsoon. And if the monsoon is late, there can be some significant shortages of water. You also have limitations in infrastructure. There's been sanitation challenges. And as a result of the growing population, the increased industrialization, et cetera, there's been a significant reliance on groundwater supplies, and those are not being replenished at the same rate they're being drained, and that's going to lead to a significant issue. The fact that the country depends so much on snowmelt runoff from the Himalayan region does expose it to future challenges in a warming climate. There's also a problem sometimes with too much water. Tropical cyclones pose significant problems to many parts of the country, particularly the northeast area around Kolkata, Bangladesh, and that area of the Indian subcontinent. And that poses a significant problem to people in terms of flooding and damage to their property. And the World Bank has estimated that 21% of India's communicable diseases are linked to unsafe water. This is a chart we put in the paper, and I quite deliberately used one from 2010 to make a point about the dire situation that has existed in parts of India and the great strides that the government has been making to try to address the issue. In 2010, 600 million people were facing high to extreme water stress. 75% of the households did not have drinking water on the premises. And 70% of the water at the time was contaminated. And as you can see, large parts of the country were under significant water stress. Now, the government in India has undertaken some extremely aggressive measures to try to address this. And they've engaged in many, many risk prevention and mitigation activities, including a commitment to creating a water management index. You know, one of the things that we often say as actuaries, you know, that what gets measured gets acted on. And one of the first challenges was simply measuring the problem. And the government has spent quite a bit of time building a water management index. There's been an aggressive program to improve sanitation by building infrastructure and installing tens of millions of toilets and providing basic sanitation. 90% of the urban population now has access to water and basic sanitation. Water tariffs, another thing that's often taken for granted in many countries like Australia, where I live. You get a water bill every quarter, and you pay for the water use. Well, in many parts of India, there were no tariffs on the use of water, which made it very difficult to encourage conservation. There was quite a bit of use of antibiotics in agriculture and healthcare, and that is an issue of a kind of circular problem where inadequate water sanitation leads people to have problems with waterborne diseases that tends to make them use antibiotics, which then turns into a problem with antibiotic resistant drugs or antibiotic resistant bugs, which then leads to problems globally with the reduced efficacy of antibiotics. And this is an example, a clear example of where water issues in one place can contribute to risk exposures elsewhere. This is our risk assessment summary for India. And I will just note up in the upper left corner where we do talk about like natural and human causes. We start off with like risk events, that water supplies become more erratic due to things like climate change, which delays the onset of the monsoon, declining snowfall in the mountains. and then even increased intensity of rainfall, which can lead to other problems of flooding and loss of life. And then you compound that with human causes such as population growth, development, etc., and also the growth of middle class changes in the types of food that's demanded. And that can shift consumption from low water use crops to high water use animal feed and other things, which can create stress on water supplies and locations that produce these foodstuffs. And we've certainly seen that effect in places like China. And so if you start thinking about the framework here for assessing the risks, the risks that a country like India faces from water, you can begin to understand the interaction of various types of risk and the challenges in controlling it. With this, I wanted to conclude on India and turn it back over to Dale to talk about some broad conclusions and implications for actuaries. Dale?
Okay, thanks, Raid. Yeah, I mean, probably a first question is, why water and why actuaries? Well, it's just an extension for sure of risk management that the actual profession is expert at, and not only the direct cause on maybe health or the sustainability of a population, but I think it broadens out into some bigger economic issues as well. So if we go to the first slide of this section, right, maybe go one forward. Yeah, I mean, we face either today or maybe in the near horizon this looming water crisis. It probably happens at different paces at different parts around the world, but especially with population growth that the world has seen over the past decades, the supply of fresh water available to sustain the population compared to the demand the population creates is an equation that is getting off balance. Supplies may be running out. In addition, non-potable water, the ability to clean it at the pace that is needed becomes a major issue, and that countries are looking for solutions to. There are disparities across different systems. All countries are different. All countries have different geographies. They have different ways of contending it. Some have plentiful resources, others not so much. And I think we note here that it's not really just a wealthy issue versus a poor country issue. Even in the United States or other major economic markets in Europe and North America and the Asia Pacific, many countries are facing this issue, or regions of their country still face this issue. Here in the US, even California, and the supply of water is an ongoing issue. And in the US Midwest, where many of our farmers are, agriculture is a main way of earning a living. When droughts occur or when water flows at a different pace or is not as controllable, there can be downstream issues with the way that water is used to provide food and to be consumed. Eventually, there may be migrations that happen. People need to be in a place where water is available and sustainable. You could start to see large migrations happening from different parts within a country or from country to country. And then, especially as Raid was noting, antibiotic resistance, maybe derived from a lot of different places. If non-potable water becomes a way to solve the problem and diseases start to occur, illnesses start to occur, and the population does have increasing antibiotic resistance, then you've got a compounding issue that's growing. The next slide talks a little bit more too about the broader economic and financial security systems, which are very much tied to what would happen if water scarcity came into play. With population migration, changes in real estate prices, the supply and demand of that could change dramatically, could have a strong impact on the location and the thriving of business activity. Of course, that then has the downstream effect of impacting equity markets and interest rates and the asset valuations that occur from those. So broader than just an issue with humans consuming water. The economic impact can be strong there. As we mentioned, agriculture is a big part of the water use, as if there are changes in the supply and demand, the way crop yields have historically worked, or the way crop insurance can work, no longer do you have this consistent predictability of what growth and yield might be. The life and health side is certainly an impact here too. While there's a big risk for the population in general, that could have some impact for sure on the way life insurers face mortality. Often there's a little bit of difference in population issues versus insured cohort issues. But if a large issue were to happen in one particular place, or if there are risk concentration issues, future mortality can certainly play into that. I think as well, healthcare costs, whether that's supported by social systems or through insurance, is really one of the big issues that non-potable water would create. An inundation of the healthcare system by disease due to not having fresh and clean water really becomes a public health issue. Property insurers certainly face some issues. We mentioned the migration and property prices and business interruption claims could occur. Social Security and pension plans with long-term liabilities and needing assets to support them could certainly be impacted by any disruption that happens in the economy. And insurance prices probably don't consider water resource risk fully. Probably looking a little bit more at current loss costs. Maybe this is more of a capital question for insurers. If issues were to occur with losses, they're probably priced more to be supported by capital than just normal loss costs when it comes to considering water resource risks. And I think the next slide also gives some next steps. Probably an awareness for the actuarial profession. We bring the tools and the skills to do more analysis, to act and measure the impact of what's going on, integrating more with national experts or the World Health Organization or the United Nations, or different opportunities to collaborate with people who are seeking to know more about this is certainly a potential for the actuarial profession to do. And I think we also bring to the table this concept of a risk framework that Steve and Raid were also describing. How can we apply this common risk framework when it comes to this type of issue to do frequent assessments? Are things getting worse or better? Kind of as a barometer for where things might be headed down the road. And country by country, or even in pockets within a country, city by city, county by county, state by state, looking at what the risks are for water resource systems. So we've got a few minutes left, and I think we've got a little bit of time to do some questions and discussion. So we'll flip it back to coordinate that.
Yes, thank you very much. Effectively, we do have a few questions, and while we are looking at answering them, if you have more questions, please don't hesitate to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your page. The first question is on Mexico City. Mexico, when new distance water source and pipelines are sought, does that take waters from others? And if so, does that create political issues? The question was asked by Mary Osford.
Yeah, I see that here. I mean, fortunately, at least there is, a national commission, Conagua, that hopefully looks to balance those types of issues. I think, many of the considerations that go into play there are population density. So perhaps fortunately where there are large water resources with lakes that are within 50 to 100 kilometers of Mexico City, population density tends to spread out a little bit. I think the National Commission is probably trying to take that into consideration, make sure that we we don't inevitably cause an issue in another place by piping fresh water from collected lakes into the large population density of Mexico City. It probably leads to other risks as well. Infrastructure risk for sure would be part of that. If it's very reliant on one large pipeline or coming from a large set of lakes, it amplifies the risk of a natural disaster or even a terrorism event causing issues. So I think that's what the National Commission Conagua is looking to do, is balance those considerations across the different parts of the population.
Thank you very much, Dale. The next question is probably for Steve, although I think a few of you, because it's in the US, Dale and I know Ray is a bit familiar with the US too. So the question is from Max Rudolph. In the US, we're using our aquifer for fracking while they are running out of water. They support much of the mid-country breadbasket. Was this type of risk considered in the report?
Yes, Max, the answer would be yes, it was considered, but it was not considered to be a significant issue in respects to the New York City water system. I think in considering other water systems around the United States, it might be a more significant issue and might need to be surely needs to be on the list of issues.
Yeah, if Micheline, maybe I could, if Steve was finished, I could add a comment to that this is a good illustration of the interconnectedness of risks that all of these problems pose. I mentioned antibiotic resistant bugs. Fracking's another complicated problem because you do deplete water supplies in some respects when you use fracking. But if, and again, I take no position on this, so no nasty emails, but if you do replace dirty thermal coal with natural gas, then perhaps you do less environmental damage from carbon release. And again, I only mention that as not to say it's right or wrong, but just to note that it's a complicated set of interacting risks. And so it's difficult to look at any of these risks just one-dimensionally of just looking at just a fracking issue or just a disease issue without looking at the whole system.
Thank you. And we have a third question from Frank Grossman. Do you have a view on whether water resources ought to be considered private or public assets?
Who wants that one?
Micheline, this is Steve. I'll start, and I'll feed off of the comments that Ray has just made about interconnectedness. I think it's probably better to consider water resources as public assets. The problem with them being private assets is that given the interconnectedness, it's unlikely that you'll always get incentives properly aligned. I think the water resources issues that we are touching on, in my view, have major public policy implications, and I think we need to look at them. I think I was delighted to take on this paper as a project and develop it because I see these types of issues as being, as has been said, broader than climate change, but equally worthy of discussion and consideration. And actuaries, I think I'd be delighted if other actuarial bodies and other people beyond the Resource and Environment Committee wanted to get involved and extend the discussion.
And for one 10-second thing, it does indicate why we need to work with other professions, and we need to kind of make sure that we work in multidisciplinary teams that can understand all the aspects of these problems.
Okay. I have also this other question. Is India an outlier here, Raid? Or are the other countries vulnerable, to the type of issues that there is in India?
Yeah, well, India perhaps has some of the more extreme examples of some of these problems. But when you look at South Africa as an example, that almost went dry in Cape Town because they, ran out of water, or you have problems in parts of Africa with, significant drought issues combined with sanitation issues, combined with changes in rainfall patterns due to climate risk. India in many ways is an example of the problems that are being faced by countries around the world. And that's why we selected it for this paper, because it has elements of problems we've seen around the world.
Yeah. And Raid, I would also add that not just drought, but flooding is an issue here, because systems that are susceptible to major flooding, you often in a major flood situation, you get a commingling of clean and dirty water, and the water supply becomes contaminated. And from a public health standpoint, the reaction sometimes in other countries as well as India, well beyond India, the reaction is, well, we need to make antibiotics readily available because people are sick, people have illnesses that they've gotten from drinking water that they did not realize was contaminated.
Yes.
It's 8 right now, but we do have a last question, so I'll go with it. Danny Quant is asking if water is a public asset. How do private water companies like Perrier, Evian, Danone fit in the picture?
Well, there's always public-private partnerships. And,
Yeah.
you can have private capital brought to bear, building water systems and certainly helping create infrastructure and deliver services. Yet most of those organizations do need to be run with a degree of public purpose behind them, because I think it is impractical for us to consider water a completely private resource, but there's no doubt that private capital and funding is critical to delivery of water to the people who need it.
Yeah. I personally think the larger issue with these companies is the fact that their delivery system is typically or often plastic bottles, individual servings of plastic bottles, which is a major contributor to the pollution problem that Raid highlighted at the very outset. We just don't need to use individual plastic bottles. There's a trend in the United States for the bottles to become smaller, so that they truly are single serving size. And it really grates on me to see that happen.
It does put pressure on the system. So that's all the time that we had. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much to the presenters. You've done a fantastic job and a great paper. You will have this presentation available if you want to look at it afterwards, or as Ray mentioned earlier, there's a link in the IAA website under publications for the paper, and there will be a link to the webinar. So thanks a lot, and see you our next presentation on the next topic from resource and environment. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.